Where can people get that book?
Anywhere, Amazon, local bookstore. It's all the places people buy books. It's available.
Wonderful.
It's called Vote for Us.
Vote for Us by Josh Douglas,
That's
professor
right.
at the University of Kentucky College of Law.
Yep.
Thank you for being with us here today. Normally we start off by asking all our guests, what would your protest sign say? So I'm going to throw it out at you. I wasn't going to, but since we know each other, what would your protest sign say?
Let everyone vote.
And we're here for that.
Yeah. Now, and let me also say, by the way, that my work as an academic and my work on voting rights advocacy is explicitly nonpartisan. And so, I've worked with Republicans, I've worked with Democrats, and I take a viewpoint that we should let everyone vote while also thinking about the security of our elections. But let's let everyone vote and let the best ideas and the best candidates win, and not the election rules. But I'm not representing any partisan viewpoint or political party. My viewpoint is let everyone vote.
And I would agree with you. Voting should be a nonpartisan issue in that the United States, what were we founded on? The freedom of the people, the Declaration of Independence, and all that we fought for and all our veterans have fought for is for our freedoms. And one of those greatest freedoms is the right to vote. So we're thankful that you're here with us today to answer just a few questions. So I'm going to just switch it over to my partner over there, Doug Price, to begin with the questions.
Thank you, Denise. Professor Douglas, we're glad to have you here. I think I've already told you that I bought your book. I haven't read it yet, and you've already told us where we can find it, that is great. As far as voting, is the bigger problem fraud, or is the bigger problem people not voting?
Oh, absolutely. The biggest problem is people not voting. There's all this our theory out there, the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, these crazy conspiracy theories about fraud. And let me say from an academic perspective that while fraud exists sometimes, it's a pretty small amount of fraud. When we have this debate about voter access versus election integrity, well, we need to make sure that we are, securing our elections to avoid potential fraud, but not doing so at the expense of not letting people vote. There's no question for any objective viewer or researcher would say that while fraud exists. I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist at all. It's a very small problem, especially as compared to hurdles to the ballot box.
What do you think the state legislature could do to help this process? The reason I mention this, they passed a resolution talking about voter fraud, but in my opinion, and I agree 100% with you, the greater issue, people not voting. Why isn't there something going on and having somebody, you chair this committee that looks at getting more people to vote?
Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted problem, right? And the question of why do we not have higher turnout is complex. 2020's election nationwide had turnout of about 65%, so maybe a little bit higher than that. And we were kind of celebrating record turnout. And yet I thought, well, a third of the eligible electorate didn't show up. So although it's great that we had a more engaged electorate, it's not good enough. When you get to the end of my book, a little spoiler alert, you'll see that I call for 90% turnout. I say, why not strive for something like 90%? It sounds crazy only because we've never had something like that before. So the question then is, why do people not vote? And I think there are multiple reasons. One is that they think their vote won't matter, won't make a difference in the outcome, or even whoever wins isn't going to change their lives. So we need much stronger civics education so people can understand why it does matter and the history of why this country has tried to to prevent many people from voting. And then hurdles to the ballot box. And we make it too difficult to vote. You know, here in Kentucky, if you don't register 29 days before the election, you can't vote. And so if you can become interested the weekend before election day, too bad. And there's really no need for that. We know because there's a bunch of other states that have same day voter registration where you can show up to the polls, you can register, you can vote. There's no fraud in those states. They have mechanisms in place to do that. And not surprisingly, those states have higher turnout. So we have a bunch of hurdles to the ballot box, and we need to break those down. Part of the problem is that entrenched politicians run our elections, right? So who do you have to convince? You have to convince the legislature who won under the prior rules. And they think the prior rules are great because they won. So why would you change those rules to risk them not winning re-election? So it's a pervasive problem that needs to be attacked from many different angles.
And, you know, you spoke about the 2020 election, you know, the outpouring of voting, which was not even enough for a real prize or a kudos, in my opinion. What do you think about the current efforts of leaders who have been elected to positions now, I guess, putting more roadblocks in the way of voting?
Yeah, I mean, we see this happening. We see this happening in places like Georgia and Arizona. I know this will be played on, I think, Monday night, but we're speaking today, recording this because I have a conflict on Monday, and we're recording this just a day after Georgia passed a very suppressive voting law that's going to make it very difficult for counties to have drop boxes. It's going to limit the amount of early voting days. It's even going to make it a crime to give someone water or food while they're waiting in line to vote. You know, so Georgia is making it more likely that you're going to have longer lines, and then prohibiting people from assisting those people waiting in those lines, just giving them some water. I don't know how water might lead to fraudulent votes. I think the theory is that someone who gives water, or like there's these organizations called Pizza to the Polls that sends pizzas, people can donate and then sends pizzas to people waiting in line. I guess the concern is a slice of pizza might make someone be unduly influenced. You know, I'm only going to give you this slice of pizza if you vote the way I want. I mean, it's absurd, right?
Right.
And what they're trying to do is, you know, the Georgia Republicans, and here, although as I started out by saying I'm nonpartisan, I'm also factual. And the fact is, it's the Republican Party in Georgia that is seeing the demographics of the state and seeing how Joe Biden won the state and 2 Democratic senators won the state. And they're trying to find ways to prevent that from happening in the future. And they think higher turnout is the problem. But, you know, the other thing I'll note about that turnout is we had record turnout in 2020 and Republicans did really well.
Yes.
Besides the top of the ticket, where you had a historically unpopular incumbent president, Republicans did extremely well by and large across the country. And so I don't think Republicans should be afraid of higher turnout and be afraid of the voters. You know, make your ideas and your candidates compelling. Don't try to win elections by shaping the electorate. Now, my friends on the Republican side might say, well, the Democrats are trying to do it too by trying to expand voter rolls. But, you know, expanding voter rolls means effectuating the constitutional and fundamental right to vote. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any security safeguards, but let's have security safeguards that make actual sense, that root out real problems, not phantom problems in our election system.
Previously here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, during the pandemic, we had our governor, Governor Andy Beshear, and Secretary of State Michael Adams, who were able to put their political party affiliations to the side and work together. There's been, I'm assuming, a small group of folk who believe their efforts of working together and setting up the early voting process that were established for us all to vote here in Kentucky was somehow unconstitutional. Have you heard of this somewhat of an argument or belief?
Yeah, this will get a little bit into the constitutional weeds, but I can try to do it fairly quickly. The US Constitution says that state legislatures get to decide the manner of appointing presidential electors. So at the founding, many states just said, we just want to give our electors to the candidate we like the most. But history has favored the voter, as a Supreme Court decision has noted. And every state now has passed a law saying the voters get to decide and vote on election day to appoint our presidential electors. Now, the issue that some people are raising is that if the governor and secretary of state jointly change or promulgate election rules for how that presidential election will run, and also the same kind of sentiment applies to the running of congressional elections. The Constitution says that the legislature shall decide them. The argument is, well, if it's the governor and secretary of state that's creating rules for expanding early voting, for example, or expanding absentee voting, and that's how we're selecting the presidential electors, well, then that's not the legislature. So in the law, this is referred to as the independent state legislature doctrine, where essentially the legislature gets to be completely independent of any other constraints, that the governor can't have a say, the secretary of state can't have a say, the state Supreme Courts can't have a say. So this was an argument in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a ruling saying that the prior rules about when absentee ballots could arrive violated the state constitution, which grants the right to vote. And the argument was that that was in itself unconstitutional under the federal constitution because it was the state Supreme Court making rules for the election instead of the state legislature, and only the legislature should have the power to do so. Now, I think there are a lot of flaws with that argument, but that's the argument that some people are making, to say the legislature and only the legislature should be allowed to make election rules for federal elections.
Gotcha.
HR 1, For the People Act. I know you've been following that. Among the key tenets of the bill to overhaul the nation's election system, allowing for no excuse mail voting, at least 15 days of early voting, automatic voter registration, restoring voter rights to felons who have completed their prison sentences. Are these good ideas or bad ideas?
They're generally good ideas because they would impose rules on states that expand voter access while also ensuring the integrity of the system. So, expanding voter access and election security don't have to be mutually exclusive, but we have to look at best practices. And in fact, my book looks at all of those exact reforms you mentioned, and Congress didn't make them up. All of those things that you listed are already happening in some states around the country, and they're happening in so-called blue states, they're happening in so-called red states, they're happening in so-called purple states. So people are afraid of vote by mail. Utah has their election by the mail. No one seems to think that democracy is broken in Utah and that the Republican Party is somehow at risk of losing by using an expanded voting system like that. And so what Congress did when crafting HR 1 was look at the best practices from around the states, all the things I talk about in my book, and use those that are already working well to expand voter access without imposing integrity concerns, and putting them into the bill that Congress certainly has the constitutional rights under the US Constitution to direct states to do these things, at least for congressional elections. The US Constitution says that states shall determine the time, place, and manner of running elections, but Congress may alter or amend those regulations. So Congress is allowed to step in and mandate changes for how states run their congressional elections. So HR 1 has a lot of great things in the bill. There's stuff I'd like to see that is not in it, like even further expansions. And I also highlight that Kentucky is being seen as a national leader again with this new bill going through the legislature right now, HB 574, which has a few things that are kind of similar to HB 1 in Congress. But the Kentucky version, it's very mild. So it certainly doesn't have everything I'd like, but it's a great compromise bill. It has stuff like 3 days of early voting required. Now, 3 days doesn't sound that great, except for when you realize that we had 0 days of early voting previously. I've heard the argument that well, the bill is taking away absentee voting like we had in 2020. That's not accurate. We had absentee voting, expanded absentee voting in 2020 because of the governor and secretary of state's emergency regulation. But the law is that there's very limited absentee voting. I'd like to see that expanded. It's not in this bill. But what the bill does have is it makes the online portal to request an absentee ballot for those who are eligible, it makes that permanent. It also has great security things like mandating paper ballots for any new voting machines, or having a risk limiting audit after the election, which basically is a way to verify that the machines worked properly and that the count was correct. So this is a great compromise bill that's got a little both of things for both sides, which is why it has so much support in the legislature. HR 1 is seen as a Democratic power grab. I disagree. It's a voting rights power grab. It's let's expand the electorate and make it easy for people to participate.
I would recommend everyone go out and purchase on Amazon and where all books are sold, Vote for Us by Joshua Douglas.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your input. Very valuable.